City of Stevens Point Housing Taskforce meeting, recorded October 25, 2022.
It is 3:15 and we have a quorum here for the Housing Task Force, so we will get started. Director Kanowski, I assume you've taken a roll call.
Yes.
Excellent, so we will move on. We have a number of items on our agenda today. The first one would be an introduction and definition and discussion on housing insecurity in Stevens Point, and this is an issue that has come up in a variety of ways over the course of the last years staff has done some work to really hone in and quantify that, so included in the packet was some information about it, but Chris, are you going to be taking that?
Yeah, I'll introduce this topic a little bit further. So you may have noticed in September that we did not meet because we were approached by a few members trying to acknowledge that we have not quite quantified the amount of work that's happening for the housing insecure population within the city of Stevens Point through this process. And so based on some directives from Director Kanowski, staff had convened a member or a group of those members to better understand how we should be identifying the housing insecure population and addressing the needs of them within the city of Stevens Point. And so from that conversation, city staff had acquired a few, marching orders to gather that information and start brainstorming some possible solutions for us to consider. But before we get too much further, the city needed to identify and quantify just how prevalent housing insecurity is within the city of Stevens Point. And so you may have noticed in the revised Housing Task Force white paper, the report, goal number 1 had been modified to decreasing housing insecurity within the city of Stevens Point rather than just the modification to the definition of family. And within that goal, we include a definition that is used by the Urban Institute that housing insecurity is a real, persistent, and growing problem with implications for people's education, health, and well-being. Housing insecurity can take a number of forms, including homelessness, housing cost burden, residential instability, evictions and other forced moves, living with family or friends to share housing costs or doubling up, overcrowding, living in substandard, poor quality housing, or living in neighborhoods that are unsafe and lack access to transportation, jobs, quality schools, and other critical amenities. So if you read through that definition, there's a lot of different components to housing insecurity. Some of them are much more hard for us to quantify. And so to gain an initial definition for housing insecurity, we took a look at cost burden throughout the city of Stevens Point. We used census data to pull in the number of rental units and owner-occupied units with a mortgage or without a mortgage, and broke that down by their housing costs and the average persons per unit to define how many people, estimate how many people there are within the city of Stevens Point that are housing insecure just based on housing cost burden, and come out to over a quarter of our population within the city of Stevens Point being housing insecure. Note that this does not include those who are already homeless. These are people who are at risk of becoming homeless. I think Mark Cordes and I took a pretty long investigation into this number, and also could point out that research is starting to show that once housing costs rise to 32% or higher of your income, the risk of homelessness or becoming unhomed increases significantly. So this is a good marker to show the population that there are a significant amount of residents who are at risk of becoming unhomed. Now, this is not a comprehensive definition of housing insecure. This is just one component of housing insecurity. I would like to use this at least as a baseline before we move into the rest of the conversation today.
Thanks, Chris. Does anyone have any immediate comments or questions about the housing insecurity definition? Pop on the online real quick, just okay. Well, then, really appreciate the metric and digging into that, and we'll keep that in our forefront as we're continuing. The next item that we have on our agenda is revisiting modifications to the definition of family, and we have talked about this at length in the group, and this here, what is being proposed is in many ways a solution to what we were just discussing in housing insecurity, and then moving forward with what we can do. Mark, are you going to speak to this?
Sure.
Your memo?
As part of the work group that was convened, I guess we talked about a lot of different things, some of which Chris already touched on. And the one item that came to the forefront was the definition of family. And I think, well, hopefully people have read that memo. If they haven't, I can just touch on briefly why that was revisited. And basically, with any solution that we look at, there's the theory of Occam's razor. It's the simplest solution is usually the best solution. It should be looked at first. And in this case, the simplest solution is taking advantage of available bedrooms and housing units. Within everything the city has done, the housing task force, the housing study that was done, everything's identified higher density residential, but really what we have is a low density requirement with our family definition. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're our own worst enemy. And what is this based on? It's based on old parochial Judeo-Christian definition of family, marriage, blood, those sorts of things. It doesn't take into account, current conditions. Harvard, I didn't note it in here, but Harvard just recently did a study in 2020. The 3 fastest growing segments of the rental population are minorities, people over 55, and non-traditional families. So those are the 3 fastest growing components of the rental market. When we look at family, first of all, we can look at removing the definition. I think the work group in general, I think all the people are here that were on the work group, so if I say anything that's not accurate, please stop me. But I think there was an appetite to simply do away with the definition of family and use square footage, as many communities do, including our neighbors to the south in Plover, and our adjoining states in Iowa and Michigan have done away with it either by court action or by passing statutes that eliminate communities from regulating in this way, because it is discriminatory, has been determined that in those areas. So, that's something to consider. But, so we considered that. We understood there's probably not an appetite for that. There'd probably be significant outcry. It's a major change. But that is something it was agreed to that should be worked towards. So as we looked at the city of Stevens Point, which again is the most restrictive city in the entire state as far as the definition of family, what are the other options? 3 was proposed. We looked at 4. Why 4? Well, strictly we look at it from a numbers perspective. We looked at all the rental units in the city of Stevens Point. 55% of those are 2-bedroom units. So we take the very realistic scenario of 2 unmarried couples that want to cohabitate in a 2-bedroom, and the availability within the marketplace, that's the vast majority of the marketplace. So that should have the largest impact. And I did an affordability analysis. That's just basic math. It should increase slightly the amount of available stock. It's not going to happen immediately, but over 1 to 2 years, we should see a difference. It'll also reduce the nonconformity within the city. Right now, we have licensed properties that can have more than 2 unrelated people. This would reduce the nonconformity within the city by over half, which is always a goal of zoning in general, or code amendments, so you can reduce nonconformity. There's also consideration, we saw this pretty prevalently in the Pacific Northwest, where if somebody lives on site and wants to have unrelated people live there. And really this was an incentive in cities. This does apply to Stevens Point. We have these large homes where a single person wants to buy them and rehab the house, but they have 4 or 5 bedrooms and it's a single person. It gives them the opportunity to rent that house with essentially an on-site manager. So we know with rental properties, if we have on-site management, essentially the owner living there, the chances we have problems with those properties is dramatically less. That's just something to consider. I did put a definition in there. Another thing we could do within that definition is the IDD, household entity, could just be incorporated into, that one or more persons related by blood or meeting the IDD, household entity definition, as would be defined in that portion of the code, could just be considered a household entity. So there'd be no limit on the number of people. It would just be limited based on the square footage of living space that's available within that unit. Chris touched on this, and then I did at the end of the memo, 28%, I think that number is shocking. I've shared that number with a lot of people, and that has been a very surprising number to everyone, including the folks at the United Way. I was on a call there, and I think that's been the biggest takeaway. People don't realize that 28% of our people within the city, and this is 2020 data, this isn't taking into account the increase in housing costs, just the challenges that have happened over the last 2 years. So it's the easiest solution, it's the simplest solution, it's a no-cost solution. Is there going to be a little pushback? Sure, there's going to be a little uncomfortable pushback from a few people, but I would encourage everyone as we discuss this, when you hear people talk, are they talking from a me perspective or are they talking from a we perspective? The we perspective is going to be inclusive, it's going to consider the entire community and the impact. The me perspective is going to be fear-based, it's going to be speculative, and it's going to be about the status quo. So keep that in mind when people are talking about this, and I think that will give you context into what they're saying and whether it's based in reality and what's happening in our community, what's happening right now. We've had, actually, so I just got this data. We've talked about increase in homelessness in Portage County. The pre- and post-COVID eviction filings within Portage County have increased by 23%. So that's directly correlated into, and Tiffany, I think you can speak to this.
Yep.
That number is probably spot on.
Yep, I was over capacity on our first night opening a month early.
Yeah, so this isn't getting any better, and actually I had to speculate, I had to take and average out the last couple months of 2020 or 2022 because I only had data up till August, but it's exactly in line with what happened in 21 and well above what was 2019 baseline data prior to this. So the eviction rates are not going down. They're staying very steady and steadily at about 23% above our baseline. So this is not going away. This isn't a problem that requires a small solution. It requires pretty big thinking and right now to take advantage of this opportunity to do something. With that, I'll stop, answer any questions or whatever you want me to do.
Lisa, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. You had said that there were court actions that forced the elimination of the definition of family.
Yes.
Can you frame that a little bit for me?
So they either, one of two things. California took a little different approach. They said it's an overreach of government. You can't ask if you're related by blood or marriage. The other ones just said it was discriminatory.
Okay.
So the courts in those states were not uniform. California was the outlier. They didn't even get into whether it's legal as far as being discriminatory or non-discriminatory. They said, government, you simply can't ask that question. So, I work in enforcement, and I should also say for the people that don't know here, I think most of you do, I work for the city of Stevens Point, but I'm also on the board for HPP, and I am the founder of the Rent Ready homelessness rehousing program, and in that capacity, we've put 38 families in housing over the last 2.5 years. Some of them, Tiffany, a lot of those people, and these are homeless people, so this is something that's directly impacted the community. But I also say we're incredibly overwhelmed. We have, luckily, people like Travis that help us out getting people in housing, but the amount of people coming into the program is outstripping the amount of available housing and landlords willing to work with us.
I'm just kind of focused on the potential litigation if we're the most restrictive in the state and quite possibly in the upper Midwest?
I don't know. I mean, it's readily available as far as so some communities have no definition, and some communities have a
Right.
definition with a higher number, a higher threshold.
But what you're saying is there is that potential, which I'm always mindful of as a policymaker. We don't want to go down that path. But I think the other part is the flip side is there's an alternative. What Plover is doing is saying X number of people per square feet.
Yeah, we already have that in our codes.
Yeah,
That's
so-
already there. It's in the building code and the property maintenance code.
So that has served Plover well, I'm assuming, and are there other college towns, because I think that's probably one of the issues that you're aware of that just uses square footage?
So we looked at two communities, looked at the city of Eau Claire and the city of Appleton.
Okay.
As it relates to the definition of family, how they define family within their zoning codes, and how that's impacted rent costs.
Okay.
Primarily.
Okay.
So for example, the city of Eau Claire and the city of Appleton, neither of them define the number of blood-related individuals that can live together in a single-family household, correct?
I believe so. I know Appleton for sure. I
All
wasn't
right,
sure.
and I know
on
about Eau Claire. So,
Okay.
Yeah. So when you compare the cost of rent in both of those communities to Stevens Point, the median cost of available rental units within all three communities are about the same, and all have changed pretty dramatically over the past 3 years. Since 2019 into 2022, I think we saw a 52%
Yes.
increase in rental costs in all three communities, about 50%. Stevens Point, not far. I mean, there's no difference based on the definition of family.
Okay.
So that's the information we were able to gather.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that was one thing, Chris, I'm glad you brought that up. Really, when we look back to 2019, and everybody knows rent and housing costs have went up. So housing cost goes up, rent costs is going to go up. But it was over 50% in all three of those communities, and it was linear. We actually printed out the data, and the curves were almost identical in all three communities. So, I mean, what you're seeing is real. I mean, we're finally putting numbers to that, and we can see the eviction rate is matching what you're seeing in real life. And what you're hearing from people is rents are going up and there's less available. Those are real things that are happening, and we can now quantify those.
Thank you for answering the questions, both of you.
Can I speak to what Mark is
ahead.
talking about? So, also, I have a letter from a community member that she would like me to read based on this point. Am I able to do that?
Sure.
Okay, I'll do that last. As you all know, because I've stated this before, I really do not think the city has any capacity, right, ability, authority to define family. It did come from Judeo-Christian ethics. I'm a little bit of a representative of the Christian ethic, and it is no longer a definition that we would hold. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some who would still hold it that way, but it is no longer a definition we would hold. But in any case, no matter what, it is just, it is
A relic?
morally and ethically beyond the bounds of the city to make that kind of definition. So I think we put ourselves in a precarious place, and especially when we want to be owning the logo, people are the point. If people are the point, then it has to be all the people. I cannot tell you, I've counted up, so we've been able to help 40 people with housing costs. I cannot tell you how many people we've had to turn away, because I don't have the time to count that number. And now we're at a point, if they come to me and we have the money, I have nowhere to help them get into housing. Nowhere. None. This is an immediate situation, and if people are the point, we have to maximize housing in this city. Now, winter is coming. I get it. I know. Nobody wants them in their backyard. Nobody wants to have to deal with it. I know it's messy. Trust me, I know it's messy. But they are human beings. They are our neighbors. And this is about who we are as a city. And so I get it. This is my rap in here. He gets to be logic and pragmatic, but I'm going to bring this to the table because it is a huge issue, and we cannot just act as if it's not happening. We took away Point Motel, and I'm not arguing the reasons why. I'm not, the Edgewater, their trailer units. Where do we think our neighbors are going to go? Tiffany does not have enough room for them. Salvation Army does not have enough room for them. We have to maximize our housing. This is the fastest, easy way to do it. I really don't want us to define family. I think we should go with square footage because I don't think the city should be defining family. I'm happy to be a city representative of the Housing Task Force. To anybody who wants to talk about that point, I will gladly do that. So that's my 2 cents, but let me tell you from Tori Bradley. Dear Housing Task Force members, as we know, the stock of available affording housing in our community is a major issue and a limiting factor for many in our community. At One Big Tent, we see folks in our community who have exhausted their resources and are already homeless or teetering on the brink of eviction. They find themselves with nowhere to go. On Facebook, community pages like the Stevens Point Happening Now, Stevens Point Area Need Offering Group, and Stevens Point Area Moms Save and Support typically receive posts every week from community members seeking help in finding housing. The majority of the people in these posts are hardworking, have children or other dependents, and have found themselves with limited resources. Some are attempting to leave an unhealthy situation for the sake of themselves and their children. Affordable rentals are snapped up quickly, causing those seeking housing to face uncertain and vulnerable circumstances. The impacts of inflation, the ending of COVID relief benefits, and our limited affordable housing supply are creating a dire situation in our community. Action is clearly needed. I ask the task force to please propose a code amendment that either redefines family to include up to 4 or more unrelated individuals, or to remove this stipulation and replace it with a square footage-based requirement that will result in an increase in tenants per unit from current standards. This is a simple, immediate step that can be taken to increase the housing stock in our community while decreasing rental costs. It would allow individuals to cohabitate lawfully while working to regain solid financial ground. It will provide greater options, stability, and dignity, especially for those who are facing the harsh necessity of living out of their vehicle or continuing to live with an unsafe partner. And a lot of our neighbors do that, friends. Such a code amendment has the potential to directly and positively impact the lives of our neighbors and strengthen our community within a relatively short time period. Thank you for your consideration and all of your hard work on this difficult issue. Gratefully, Tori Bradley, One Big Tent board member and Rent Ready mentor.
Could I ask that that be placed on file?
Sure. If you just tell me how I do that, I will gladly do that.
I think you send that to Ryan or Chris, and they will make sure that the rest of the task force.
I will certainly do that.
And then it will be made publicly available.
Mark, if I can circle back to what you said earlier, about 55% of the dwelling units in Stevens Point area, is it Stevens Point or Stevens Point area?
Stevens Point area, well, I think we can separate. I believe it's Stevens Point.
55% of our, in the city of Stevens Point, rental units are 2-bedroom. I think here's where you're going, right?
And we used apartments.com for that data. So, and you know, I just want to say a little off there, I asked Travis, and the numbers he gave me from the hip were almost spot on for the number of 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 1 bedroom studio. And I mean, Travis, those numbers were literally within like 1%, and you're shooting from the hip. But yeah.
Good deal. I guess my question is, and because not everybody probably doesn't have access to the memo you mentioned, the math that you were doing. If I understand it correctly, in a typical 2-bedroom unit, there would be only 2 people allowed in that unit, even if the code would allow by using the square foot metric. So if 3 or 4 people wanted to split an apartment cost, no more than 2 could do it. So if I'm understanding correctly, as a way to help people stretch their budgets, if 4 people wanted to share a 2-bedroom apartment and all the expenses, they could, not only would we create the number of possible places to stay safely at night, but their individual budgets they'd be paying half as much.
Absolutely correct.
Okay.
Yeah, there is now a square footage requirement, and it's 120 square foot for the bedroom for 2 people. It's 70 square feet for a single person to stay, and that's defined as a bedroom. 1 person can stay there, but when you get 2 people in a bedroom, it's 100. That's the code minimum. Okay, 120 square feet. So as long as the bedrooms meet that size, and it's a 2-bedroom, they're 120 square feet or larger, exclusive of closet area, then 2 people would legally cohabitate in that space based on the code provisions, not taking the definition of family into it. But what you're saying is absolutely correct. Yes, they can move in there, and those expenses essentially are cut in half straight across the board.
Okay.
So it increases stock, decreases the cost to the renter.
Yeah, I'm kind of chuckling a little bit because there was a sitcom, I think it was back in the 70s, it was called The Golden Girls. And apparently they couldn't have lived in Stevens Point.
No.
They would have to live in Plover.
Okay, thank you.
Good point.
All
Try to
right.
be less passionate, but can I add one more thing? Having been in this situation as a single mom who lived on welfare, finding herself in, which I'm glad we have the social services. I believe in taxes and I believe in welfare. Our systems are set up to help people in these crisis opportunities. There's a whole lot of gaps, so the idea that everybody gets crisis gets taken care of by our social service systems is not an accurate one, but those who find themselves there and find that buoy to hang on to, the only way they get out of that system is human leverage. Somebody has got to step in and change their reality. This is an example of what that can be. This can be human leverage, that we as a city decide to offer that human leverage. That's what it takes. Otherwise, they're in that system forever.
Yeah, I just add one last comment to build off what Jane said. You know, this document, at the end of the day, what we'd like to think it'll affect all the housing stock. The reality is the people with disposable income drive the market. They don't need this document. Their lives don't change because of this document. The people whose lives change because of this document are the people that rely on this, to rely on changes in policy. So now's the opportunity. And those are the people that benefit from this, not the people with disposable income that are driving the market forces in Stevens Point. We like to think the policy might drive that, but the reality is it doesn't. Dollars drive the market, and that's the way the free market system should work. But really, policy does help the people that most need it.
I'll look to the committee if there's anyone, but we do have a community member who would like to make a comment, so if anyone else on the committee.
Just want to, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you. To tag on to what you're saying and to what my dear friend Jane has said is disposable income may drive the market. However, all it takes is one major illness and an exhaustion of all of your medical resources and then your copays, and now you have 10 years of ongoing care or need a transplant, and that whole thing changes. So the fragility of security is really an illusion. And I, too, experienced near homelessness as a single mom, and I understand wanting to feel comfortable. It's really just an illusion, and it's really a heartbeat away of an accident, or as we know from one of our city colleagues who had an accident and hasn't been able to work for a while. His life has changed. So, thank you.
Ms. Rappi, I see you have your hand raised on Zoom there. If you'd like to state your name and address for the record, and if you would like to share a comment on our discussion on the definition of family here.
Yes, thank you. Nancy Rappi, 925 Smith Street. I think you really have to live in an area that is predominantly rooming houses to understand the difficulties and the challenges the neighbors face. And I think it's a gross oversimplification that, if we only had more rooming houses, it'll solve our homelessness problem. You're not addressing in the least the greed that landlords, and in my neighborhood, slumlords, the greed that goes on, how these properties are in such disrepair. And by the way, I read Stevens Point Happening now, and I've seen those posts where people are reaching out to find housing. And I would say that invariably in every single one of those posts, they state no student rentals, because those people don't want to live in areas where there are predominantly student rental rooming houses. They don't want to live in those run-down properties. And this proposal seems to me to be contrary to what the city was trying to do, to take some of these rundown student rentals that are literally unrentable and change them back to single-family residences, providing like a $35,000 incentive for people to actually do that. This, to me, is going in the opposite direction. I don't see how more rooming houses increases the stability of neighborhoods. And I would like to hear the members of this committee and Mr. Cordes disclose whether or not they own rental properties, where those rental properties are located, and whether or not they will financially benefit from this decision to change the family definition. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Cordes lives in Mosinee. He does not reside in Stevens Point. Furthermore, I take exception to part of the memo that he attached to this packet, where he suggested that people who were opposed to changes in the overnight parking rules, that there has been no impact of that, and none of the concerns have come to fruition. Since the overnight parking rules were changed, there was a pandemic, okay? The university virtually shut down. Most of the kids moved back home to mom and dad. So it was not quantifiable to determine whether or not the overnight parking rules were being violated.
Ms. Ropey, I would ask that you keep your comments more germane to our discussion here on the modification.
Well, this is directly germane because Mr. Cordes addressed that in his memo, okay? For instance, I believe this is going to be the first winter where Northside Yard has occupancy, and they charge $75 in order to park a car in their parking lot, okay? Which means you're going to be pushing cars out onto the street. So this is going to be the first winter where we're going to be able to quantify whether or not the problems that the opponents of overnight parking changes, we're going to be able to actually see. And by the way, I have had problems with people parking in front of my house overnight. I called the police department and was told there is no person in that position doing overnight parking enforcement, and the only way a car could be ticketed would be if a police officer happened to notice them, but they were not going to make it a priority to ticket cars. So what you were told in that memo is highly misleading, and I believe Mr. Cordes knows it. And furthermore, the complaint system for reporting property violations has not been functional for more than a year, and I keep being told, oh, Nancy, it'll be in September or October. And is there a date certain where it's going to be fixed? No. So before you make this decision to create unlimited rooming houses and basically codify what that one guy did across from the communications building on the university campus, he bought a beautiful old home, fixed it up, invited 7 of his buddies to move in with him, and when the neighbors realized what was going on, they objected. The city forced him to have those guys move out. Basically, what you're going to do is codify that. You're going to create a student rental in that house, help that guy out. He's going to financially benefit, but the rest of the neighborhood has to put up with that kind of situation. So I really object
Ms.
to this
Robbie, if you
turning
could
into
please
a
wrap
racist
up
thing.
your comments
It's not
here.
a race. I will. This is not a racist thing. I support the Salvation Army. I actually started the Salvation Army Milk Fund that pays for all the milk that goes to the Salvation Army since 2015. I do everything in my power to help people, okay? But what I don't want to see is the degradation of neighborhoods by more rooming houses. Aren't we going to have the Grove is going to come online? The former Point Motel area is going to come online. Wasn't the Berkshire supposed to be so helpful with this? And now we're being told there's no place for people to go. I find that hard to believe. I think there's a financial incentive here for landlords that's unspoken, and I don't appreciate it. and it's not fear-based.
Thank you for your comments, Mrs. Rappi.
May I respond?
No, we're not going to get into a response of, if there's another member of it looks like your hand was raised.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment? And if so, please step up to the lectern and state your name and address.
I'd defer if anybody isn't online.
Nope, there are no more online. And I would ask just for because we do have more on our agenda, to limit your comments to under 3 minutes, please.
Sure. Okay, I'm Bob Gifford on the county board, and while I don't have a vote on council, I do hope that this measure gets passed by council. I'd like to give the county's perspective, which I kind of pitched to Melissa earlier, and she appreciates the difficulty. I came back from the Counties Association very discouraged by the lack of activism on the housing issue in our 72 county association. Only a few counties had any presence there with doing anything toward affordable housing. So I would like to participate from the county government side and work toward making our counties activist on this issue. And I think what I was going to suggest, in terms of coalescing with many, many other what we call stakeholders or related groups. The Counties Association is well aware of some demographic facts that come up frequently, although I don't know many people are paying attention. First is a demographic crash north of Highway 21 in our northern counties. They're aging out. They're losing, some of them are frankly losing population. The workforce is aging out. They become seniors, and they join the group of housing insecure people. And the other part of that is the younger demographic, okay? I'm sure everybody's aware of the workforce crisis, the staffing shortage, and so forth. And I pitch this at county meetings as a practical matter. It's not just morality, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a practical matter. How is this county and all the counties around us going to attract a young workforce if you don't have a community where low-wage workers can get started and afford to live in the community, right? So if you're facing 35% of your income going to rent or more, you're immediately in that group of people who have to take this issue seriously. So that I would suggest, like in terms of coalition, reach out to student orgs. I invited 4 different student orgs to this meeting. I sent your thing to the Habitat for Humanity and 350 Student Government and LIT, which is kind of a minority student group. So that's one demographic to reach out to, and the other is the ADRCs, Aging and Disability Resource Centers, where we're facing the increase in poverty among elderly folks is, I just saw an article.
Gifford, if you could please wrap up.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Your
So
time
yeah,
is up.
reach out to these demographics and sort of build the biggest possible coalition to make this, to go beyond this one measure, which I hope does pass, and much further. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I will acknowledge that community member Greg, it looks like Greg Hansel on the Zoom. If you would like to speak, sir, just state your name and address for the record, and I have a 3-minute timer.
Greg Hansel, 525 Clayton Avenue, Stevens Point. I've been in Stevens Point 39 years. I want to speak in favor of this proposal. I think what we have now is archaic. And in most cities that have done something like this, cities that have worked on homelessness and housed people, found that once people are in a safe, secure spot, then they'll begin to get services and get their life back together and go back to the workforce and get jobs and contribute better to society. So that is something that I think this would help, and certainly. And I know Tiffany can speak more to that as well. Personally, as a parent who has a son who's homeless, it's a struggle in this community, and there are not a lot of options for where people should live and can live. And I think this proposal would give people on the bottom, people on the underside, a much better opportunity for life. Thank you.
Thank you. For your comments?
I'd like to just address one thing. I appreciate all the input, and I think we've all recognized that a lot of these discussions have been had multiple times. And I just want to reiterate the fact that I think and I'll put it out there, I'm a landlord, I own student properties. This will actually harm the properties I own. This will take those properties a step back because those students will be, right now those students are corralled, they're forced to live on campus. As this changes, you're going to see some of that diversify, you're going to see some of these old rooming houses that aren't going to rent. That's not where the trends are. These 6, 7, 8 person houses are not what students are renting now, and with the number of student options building up around campus, I think you're actually going to see some deflation in some of those cores. And again, I am here just as a real estate agent and a landlord trying to present what's best for the city. And I think if you take the fear out of it and take a step back and look at it, that you'll actually in the long term see some deflation in those core areas. And hopefully with the grant project, you're going to see some renovation of those existing homes, which we've seen. I know there's a couple homes on campus this year that have been converted back to single family homes already because those property values have gone up so much that I think you'll continue to see more of that.
Good point.
Say a few
Go
things.
ahead. Yes.
So a few things. First and foremost, just for the public, this is a policy recommendation group. Ultimately, the city's plan commission and the common council will have to review any changes that are brought forward and ultimately, approve, deny, amend how they see fit. Part of the reason of the task force is just to have these types of conversations to make a solid recommendation to those bodies who could eventually make a recommendation or could just completely say, we appreciate the work you did, but this is not something that we necessarily want to do. That's up to those governing bodies. I also am probably more in the minority during this conversation, namely because I'm putting on the city planner, land use, zoning administrator hat, and I'll justify or start by saying I am not by any means an expert in homelessness or the unsheltered populations. I have almost no understanding of it, and I will admit my bias from the start there. But from my background, my education, and leading the council's discussions and recommendations on policy changes, I have some concerns about just completely getting rid of the definition of family. Mark and Chris, who are both members of my staff, have heard this from me, and I had promised them that I would bring this up, but there is a real land use component. We have been trying to slowly increase our density over the last few years, whether it be affordable housing projects, the accessory dwelling units, and I understand that neither, especially the ADUs, are not a perfect solution to that problem, but really thought that there are some incremental changes that we could make to address this problem in the long-term definition, as opposed to getting rid of the definition completely, which I think is a short-term solution to what is a long-term problem. I think the city's role in this discussion really plays into how do we increase affordable housing, high-quality affordable housing. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that if someone rents a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,000 a month and now they have four people living there, that specific landlord wouldn't increase the rent to $2,000 a month. And I think that might be something that Travis or Noah could talk to as well. But I think when we start increasing densities, when we start increasing, especially in the core of our community, there are concerns that have to be addressed from the land use perspective. More parking means more impervious surfaces, which means more stormwater challenges. The higher densities you have, the more constraints you have on public utilities. And those are things that the Community Development Department has to look at when we talk about this as well. And I know that a lot of that is like abstract and can become really confusing, but that's really what, the Community Development Department is trained in. So I do have some reservations, some pretty serious reservations about just completely getting rid of the definition. I thought the increase from 2 to 3 was a good incremental step. if this body would want to increase it from 3 to 4, I think we're open to that conversation. I do additionally have some concerns about it basing it off of square footage, mainly just for the sake of administration of the zoning code, trying to figure out square footages and legal bedrooms versus illegal bedrooms that exist in this community, and they're everywhere, and trying to figure out, okay, are we having to go into a home to figure out if this bedroom is 120 square feet? Are we going to be measuring every bedroom in the city to figure out how many people could occupy this space? And that's really where I think from a practical perspective, we have to have some further discussions on whether or not it's something that the community development could even handle as we talk about definition of family and square footages, or just increasing it, 3 to 4 as an example. So those are my comments. I hope that there's more discussion, but I think from staff's perspective, from community development, the city planner's perspective, I've got some real concerns about just throwing the definition out completely.
I don't know how much is allowed to have a discussion. I mean, a lot of it was, we all want to see some change. We wanted to present something that would be palatable to the city and the council. Are we able, as this is just a recommendation, are we able to just provide like a scaled recommendation of we'd like this, but if the council's not okay with that, this would be is what we need to put forward, does that have to be a definitive, we want, we're recommending this, or can we put forward multiple, as this is going to be probably a longer discussion at Plan Commission and Council anyway, as a group, are we not maybe better off putting together a scaled and say, hey, here's some recommendations we have. I'm assuming all of these conversations will probably take place again.
Yes.
Rank them, yeah.
Luckily for
And
you.
I think some of that what Mark and Chris has done is put together numbers of impacts that, like, what this change might lead to, and what the incremental step is also a step towards.
I'll throw just a couple
Travis.
real fast comments, and just because I know we've talked about this a lot, I would like to say that we don't just see this through the vision of student housing. I mean, students are a severely declining population in our town, and what was a student market is not there anymore. For me, and our push for probably the last 5 to 10 years of we're doing this was the non-student stuff. The fact that I have 3 teachers who can't live together. The fact that I got 3 IT guys from Skyward who can't live together, and those are both real people we've had apply that we've denied because they can't live together because they aren't related. That's more, I think, where things are kind of going. Now, to answer the question of will landlords charge more, I think you most definitely will see some degree of that. I can tell you I don't charge extra per occupant, but I could see scenarios where we look at it and go, well, this house now has 4 people in it, we're at 2, I pay the utilities, more water, more electricity, there's going to need to be a little bit of incremental change to it. But I'm sure there'll be some landlords who abuse that. There'll be equally as many who don't do that at all as well, too. So, I guess I don't want to paint with a wide brush on that, but I also am not going to stick my head in the sand and say there's not going to maybe be a bad actor here or there, or a few of them, who knows. But I think the vast majority of us, I don't really care necessarily who, how many are there. It's not, we set rent on a unit, on the price, and it's not based on a per unit, per person thing, so it's just personal reference.
Good to
Just going to, and I understand what you're saying, Ryan. I love your clear-mindedness. But when my son came home from China, he was here for about 6 months, so I had my car, my daughter's car, because my daughter and my granddaughter live with me, my granddaughter's car, and then my son's work van. And we have 4 bedrooms, and we're all related. So we had the demand for 4 parking spaces. We made it work. It was a little weird at times. At the same time, our neighbor, we share a driveway. He had 2 vehicles, one for him and one for his girlfriend. And then our adjacent neighbors who also share a driveway, they had 3, all related. So within this little confine, we had basically used the parking lot. So I think I understand your concern, but I think some of those things are already happening. I have a family on the south side of the railroad tracks, and they wanted, when I first became alder, they were looking for options for parking because they had 2 kids. They were working and at Spash. Mom worked at night, Dad worked during the day, so I had 4 cars, a little bitty driveway. So I think we've got that already in our dense area of the city. Those challenges is families are very complex, they're busy, and have multiple vehicles, so.
Ryan, I really appreciate that your clear-headedness, as Melissa has called it, because I have clear-heartedness. I try to have clear-headedness as much as I can. And so I really appreciate a long-term look, because we need to have long-term solutions. But we have an immediate crisis we don't have any answers for. Crises that involve living human beings. So I get that this feels like a temporary solution, but we're going to have some temporary solutions until we get to that long-term solution, which there are other entities, I'm going to tell you, there are other entities that are working and trying to deal with the housing situation, involved in lots of conversations, and hopefully they'll all, amalgamate and come together and we'll have some longer-term solutions, but we need something now. And this won't answer all the housing problems. This is not an answer to the unhoused problem in Stevens Point. It is a finger in the dike that will help some. So, whatever we can do,
I think,
we'll be good. You're good.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think further into goal number 1, I think our next agenda item, we'll address some more of those longer term items or action that this body can recommend. But in response to Noah, I think we have prepared somewhat like a scaled recommendation to bring to this body for discussion. That scaled recommendation being just based on sheer amount of potential impact for bringing more people into a rental unit. The number 1 or most impactful option in removing the definition of family and basing amount of tenants in a unit based on the square footage requirements. Second option, expanding the definition of family to 4. We discussed the addition of an additional tenant based on owner occupancy, but that may not be feasible for us to enforce. So we'd recommend, I don't know if you want to comment on that or not.
It's just an option. Within specific areas, the boarding houses are a great one. And so you hit it right on the head. That's what Chris and I discussed. If we change this to 4, those boarding houses are borderline right now as far as feasible. And a lot of them are turning over. They don't have the student population. So we do have people looking at them. We do have some funding available. But the reality is people are looking at them, want to owner occupy, and they're younger guys, typically, that are kind of industrious, looking at rehabbing these places. But they want to live there, they want to bring some roommates in. Right now they can't do it. It's not economically feasible.
And then I guess the third level in that scale would be the current recommendation to expand the definition of family to 3. So that we believe that would be the highest impact for increasing the number of people into a household or a rental, and as a result of that, the highest decrease in housing insecurity based on rental costs alone.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead, Melissa. Question.
So I like conversation because I love ideas, but I like more implementation of ideas and action. And what I'm hearing from Jane and Bobby Joy, and of course, Tiffany, you haven't spoken, but
I'm with them.
I know that.
Yes.
I'm a mind reader.
Yeah.
Is we have an emergency situation. And I guess this would be a question for Attorney Beveridge, who I believe is on, is could we, and this is listed as an action item, so we could take action on something coming out of this moment right now. And my question for Attorney Beveridge is, could there be an emergency recommendation, which is sunsetted, let's say, emergency recommendation to advance to Plan Commission, because that would be the first step, and then ultimately to Council to short term, so emergency status, the definition of family until, and sunset it on April 15th, because let's just go with that, because that's I think the moratorium on shutoffs for utilities. To meet sort of a short-term need, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, including Bobby Joy and Jane and property owners downtown and concerned citizens and other clergy, and everybody, we recognize that this is a crisis situation. We cannot have people sleeping on the street and have a vibrant community. It's counterintuitive. So my question for Attorney Beveridge, could we make a motion for an emergency action and then sunset that action to give time to go through what we need to do and set a priority list for further recommendation farther down the road?
So a couple of thoughts. First of all, when I hear the word emergency in the context of policy, the first thing I think of is, okay, what particular emergency declaration or procedure that references that term are you referring to? And off the top of my head, it sounds like you're kind of using the word emergency more in just sort of a
common term,
common vernacular. It's not really tied into, under such circumstances, there can be an emergency use of such and such authority. In fact, actually, this body here isn't really governed by anything other than, some basic actions of the Common Council that created this, temporary ad hoc group to comment on certain issues. So I'm not sure that the, invocation of the word emergency really actually has any sort of legal meaning to it in this context. Second of all, we are talking obviously about a change to the zoning code, which has state statute requirements in terms of notice, in terms of publication of public hearing dates, and all the trappings that go along with any type of change to the zoning code. So, certainly this body can take a vote to, communicate an opinion to the Plan Commission, and something could be placed on the Plan Commission for their consideration, so long as we meet the requirements for timetable and all that stuff, like I just referenced. But in terms of a sunset clause on something like this, I haven't researched whether there can be sunset clauses on zoning provisions that are of general applicability. I'm not aware off the top of my head of anything in 6223 that describes or contemplates that, or of any particular case law. There may or may not be anything out there to that effect. However, I think from an administrative standpoint, just sort of a nuts and bolts and practicality aspect, I mean, it's, you tell people, hey, you can do this for 6 months, and then, I mean, it is notoriously difficult to even detect violations of overoccupancy in the first place. And when you invite people to do it, but on a temporary basis, I think it's going to become like one of those situations where we did this temporarily and now we are basically compelled to make it permanent, because it's just going to be impracticable to enforce it if the decision is made to reverse it. So I think there's a lot more conversation to be had on this, obviously. It's been kicked around in sort of the background for a long time, but we've never really heard from the public on it very much. We've never really heard until literally today all that much from this sort of broad spectrum of, whether it's people who are working to address homelessness, or whether it's the landlords or just homeowners. So sensitive to the time of year, absolutely, but we can't get around those timetables for things on Plan Commission, and considering that's held on the first Monday of the month, I don't think that there's any possibility that could be heard until the beginning of December.
Well, there's no time like now to start?
So just real quick, we did provide a sunset provision this last summer for tourist rooming houses for the USGA golf tournament. That is probably the only, in, I don't know, my almost decade of zoning that I've ever known that we've put a sunset on a specific item, and that was to address the influx of visitors for that specific tournament. We are past the typical publication deadlines for public hearing notices for the November meeting. There could be an ask to the chair of the Plan Commission, the mayor, to hold a special Plan Commission meeting to consider this. I'm just thinking administratively how that would have to happen. And, if you want to do it sooner rather than later, having it by the second meeting of November, we would probably have to publish something in the Gazette by the end of next week. So we need, Tuesday is our print deadline,
Right.
essentially.
So for, non-policymaker members of the committee, we have had special plan commission meetings that coincided with our standing committee meetings, which is the second Monday of the month. So plan commission's first Monday, standing committees second Monday, and then of course council third Monday. And we have done it before, so it's not unprecedented. But again, the reason we're all here is to not only come up with ideas, but to advance them beyond this really nice group of people who care passionately about this topic and want to do the right thing. But short of using the word emergency, because while I love Logan and his lawyer brain, we could parse out using the word emergency, challenging situation, fearful situation for those who are most at risk, whatever words you want to use. But when Alder Dalton and I started talking about this about a year ago, and then came up with the charter, this is exactly what we envisioned, is that a group of really caring individuals come together with ideas to help make this a better community, and this is one option. So at least short term, so that we can consider longer term.
Can I, sorry, go ahead.
With what we were tasked by the council, are we to provide, I guess, do we have just one opportunity to present proposals, or can we move a proposal forward and continue to work on other pieces?
You have all kinds.
Okay.
In terms of going beyond what was kind of the initial sunset, this was when we chartered it to be determined to be a sunsetted group that we would have a paper at the end, but there hasn't been anything stopping anyone from coming to meetings. There's always the non-agenda item time that any member of this committee or community can come and speak, and that would be a time to come and speak this, as well as we could place upon a council agenda an item to discuss a particular item of discussion. So yes, the proposal to basically recommend that the Plan Commission take up this item now or immediately as a part of the public hearing, with the intention that a change that they would vote on would be sunsetted at the April 15th. Let's say that there isn't anything stopping our body from recommending that.
To sunset this? I mean, I guess if it goes through the process of discussion in council, is there a reason to sunset it, or is it just something, this is something?
Just throwing it out there.
Okay. Is that where you're going?
To lower the temperature?
I was going to kind of say the same thing here too, that I'd say skip the sunsetting thing and just see if you can move this point forward, because I think the sunsetting thing could throw some issues our way. The minute you stop this in April, what happens to our leases?
Yeah.
And what happens, like, are they allowed to renew
All
if
those
they've already lived there? What about
implications.
subletting? It's like,
Yeah.
I'm just like,
No.
all of my legal end of things starts going, where are we going with this then? I'd much rather just be a clear-cut permanent thing, but I'm all in favor of saying if you don't, I mean, if we can advance certain points forward without having it all at once, I wouldn't be opposed to that.
That's why I like having smart people around me, because I come up with ideas and then I look to the smart people to tell me I missed a few points. So thank you.
Well, if we have the fortitude and the willingness to meet the influx of moneyed visitors, to make sure they're sheltered while they're in Stevens Point, I would certainly hope we have the fortitude and the willingness to do the same for our own people who live in this city and who are disadvantaged for a variety of reasons.
And I'm going to touch on that too. Opening a month early because of the freezing temperatures, people didn't even know we were open, and we were over capacity on our first night. I watched the trend for the last few years. 7 years in now on this, and oh my gosh, I am very nervous for this winter. And if you haven't seen it downtown this summer, it's the first time it's kind of exploded as to what it's been. And then the statistics from Mark, the evictions, I'm not shocked. Some other people might be shocked, but I'm not shocked because I see it every day. So whatever we can do to push this forward, there's a lot of people that come to my shelter that are employed, that have money but not enough money to do this. Let's get them and the friends working together and help supporting one another. And that in itself helps those individuals have somebody be there for them on top of that. So there's a support group that gets built into this little infrastructure here if we can get more people into one house that are unrelated at the same time. So I am completely for whatever it takes to push this forward as quickly as possible, because otherwise I'm gonna need all y'all to come volunteer at the shelter this winter to help take care of everyone, so.
I'm getting the sense that there is a desire to make a motion and take action as an immediate, with this as an immediate recommendation, but as chair, I will not be the one doing that. And so I will ask that if somebody is interested in doing that, that maybe they do so now, and that we would then continue on our agenda.
Is there a draft from staff that we should review first?
Well,
That we would, or
I would say that it sounds, what I am gaining from our discussion is that there is a desire to recommend that the Plan Commission review the housing entity definition at a special meeting this month, as that would be a public hearing, with the desire of increasing it such that people could be housed more densely beginning this winter as soon as possible. And that would be an individual piece of policy that they would be reviewing, a change in the zoning code that requires a special hearing, and it would not be the entire white paper that it's just like a specific thing we're trying to advance.
So essentially not giving a recommendation, but asking for a review of the current one in hopes that they do something. We're not telling them, we'd like to see 3 unrelated.
Well, okay, all right. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead, Dr. Karnowski.
Please do.
Okay, I just the wheels are turning here. If you take something to the Plan Commission and say, just review it.
Yeah, it's review and take action.
You know, you want them to review the definition of family, and they're going to be presented with the same information this body has, and I am fearful that it's going to be tabled until another meeting so there can be more discussion on it. Just for those in the audience, it took us about a year to do the accessory dwelling unit ordinances because there was a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth neighborhood meetings. So if I was part of this body voting, I would recommend a specific policy recommendation to the Plan Commission, and that will give city staff the opportunity to review the recommendation, draft some type of staff report based on this body's recommendation, present it to the Plan Commission so they can present that to the Common Council. Instead of broadly speaking, just look at the definition of family. What specific action would this body, like the Plan Commission, look at?
So something like, I move that due to the imminent housing crisis, and in order to get as many residents housed during the winter months as possible, we recommend that they increase the family of definition to 4?
Unrelated persons.
Unrelated persons.
I'll second that.
There is a motion and a second on that. Does everyone from the group here have a clear understanding of what our housing task force would then be recommending and what you would be voting on, as this is our first actionable item, I believe?
And just clarification, with no sunset.
With no sunset.
Okay.
Yes. And we shall be there to let them know why no sunset.
Are you?
And there could always be the discussion that if they wanted to sunset for a year or so, you know, that is within their purview too.
I offer a friendly amendment, and maybe that's part of the staff report, is the option on eliminating the definition of family and using the square footage allowance like our neighbor to the south, Plover.
It's a lovely amendment. You know, I like it.
Okay, so the amendment would be either for unrelated or complete removal of the definition. Okay.
I like the idea of giving them options. I think
since there's two policy recommendations, there should probably be an amendment. Well,
No.
yeah, I mean, I guess
vote
if
on the
you're both
amendment.
comfortable with it,
Yeah.
okay.
Vote on the amendment and then vote on the overall.
Do we have any further discussion on making that recommendation? Otherwise, we'll take a vote then.
So the
Take a vote on
first
the
one would be
amendment.
on the amendment
Amendment.
to completely
I thought it was a
remove the
friendly.
definition of family. Make a recommendation to remove the definition of family. That's the first vote, just so everybody's aware.
All those in favor say aye, sorry. Aye. Any opposed? And any abstaining? Okay, so that amendment is accepted. So now we will go back to the original motion to, as amended, to make that. Any further discussion? Okay, we'll take a vote then. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed would be no. Any abstentions? Okay. So we are making our recommendation. I'm going to take a temperature check here as it is 4:25 and we have two further items on our agenda. We began to discuss the expanding the scope of goal number 1. Would folks like to continue our discussion on those at a later date? Here, I'll give 3 options. Discuss these later at a later date and end our meeting now, or at our next meeting. Maybe option 2 would be to get a brief introduction to the next item, or option 3 would be let's just keep going and we'll have our full discussion. Nobody is jumping out of their seats.
I have another meeting in a little while.
I have about 10 minutes also. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe the introduction would be good, so then it can percolate.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, our item number 4 is introduction discussion on expanding the scope of goal number 1 to decrease housing insecurity.
And I will take that. I'll be quick, as quick as I can. So with the format of the original report and white paper, we broke the goals down into community engagement opportunities, zoning opportunities, and economic development opportunities. So the definition of family change is that primary zoning policy that we just discussed. We wanted to make sure that we included some community engagement opportunities and economic development opportunities here as well. So we've already introduced a lot of the information, the background information for why this is important, but one of the recommendations that the I guess special group that came together in September to discuss housing insecurity was that there is a missing community awareness about the sheer scope of housing insecurity. So our primary recommendation for our community engagement opportunities at a bare minimum is to announce a resolution that acknowledges the prevalence of housing insecurity in Stevens Point. So there's that. That recommended action. Down to our economic development opportunities. These are focused mostly on increasing housing stock for those who are experiencing housing insecurity in a hopes to increase the likelihood that they're able to participate in the economy as everyone else. So one thing that we realized that we're missing is over the past few years, we've seen a sharp decline in housing stock for our housing insecure populations, some that are explicitly or implicitly dedicated to our housing insecure population. And so a primary recommendation for this is to create a formal strategy between the Housing Authority and the City of Stevens Point Community and Economic Development Department. Our second recommendation is to address the need for public supportive housing, transitional housing, and formal support services that are vital to the success of those.
Sir, can you please leave that door open?
Leave the door open.
This is a public meeting,
Yeah,
so we
gotta
need
leave the door open.
Sorry. We're almost
Okay.
done. Thank you.
And so with the realization that organizations within Stevens Point are attempting to prevent housing insecure residents from becoming unhomed, we are lacking some financial levers to create those spaces and those support services for people. And so primary recommendation is that that we actively work to partner nonprofits looking to acquire properties with property owners who are looking to divest or transition the ownership of their housing options. Another opportunity or recommendation is that the city assist nonprofit partners in applying for federal funds to expand these programs. The city of Appleton and the city of Eau Claire, city of Madison, city of Milwaukee all do this very well. They've kind of laid out the template. There's some understanding within this group of how we can do that and how we can move forward in that space. Our third economic development opportunity is creating landlord incentives to generate or hold housing stock for low to moderate income individuals or persons with histories that effectively prohibit them from acquiring housing. I'll let you all read that realization at another time, but a recommended action in this space is to operate a no or low interest loan program for landlords who hold housing stock for these individuals. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development provides plenty of research to show that if we are trying to support individuals who have traditional histories that keep them from housing, working with landlords is a key to success. They have the properties, we have the people, we need to get them together. This is just one option for us to pursue for that. And then lastly, the city administers several grant programs to improve or enhance housing stock within the city of Stevens Point. Last recommendation is to develop a preventative program that proactively reduces the number of evictions that are taking place. Eviction diversion and prevention programs are pretty limited throughout the country, but have been shown to work in the city of Madison and Dane County. There are states that create their eviction prevention and diversion programs that are statewide. We could do this on a smaller scale as well. So those are all of the recommended actions that we're bringing forward to this group for further discussion, I suppose, at our next meeting.
Yes. Thank you for that introduction.
Do we want any discussion on those for now, or do you want me to skip to our fourth, or goal number 4?
Why don't you go to goal number 4?
So another thing that we're lacking within this white paper is to track implementation and results. So we have recommended actions for Plan Commission and City Council to review, but we don't necessarily identify that as a priority to make sure we are tracking what is being implemented and what the results of those implementations are. So our first recommended action is to create a tracking sheet for this information, make that public, and that would be on the community and economic development staff to maintain that document. And then second recommendation is to annually measure what we think might be results of those actions. So if at the very end of this document, you'll see a brief overview of some of the data that we've initially identified that we know we can quantify, such as the quantity of housing units constructed, quantity of affordable housing units constructed, and that would need to be further defined, quantity of housing units removed, median home values, median rental rates for studio through 4-bedroom rentals, quantity of owner-occupied housing units, percentage of owner-occupied rental units, percentage of owner-occupied housing units, percentage of residents who are housing cost burdened, as we've illustrated can be done, and other measures to determine housing insecurity as we grow.
Would these be compared to a baseline? Because that was my concern earlier with talking about how much rents have gone up, is everything's gone. It's easy to say, oh, rents are up 50%, which would depend on the unit. I don't know that I've seen those increases.
Sure.
But it's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to compare it to other metrics to say, okay, comparative to everything else. It'll be hard to gauge some of our successes if just because things are steadily increasing, that if we're trying to gauge our successes and saying, oh, over the last 2 years, rents have still increased, those are going to be hard things to compare relative to, without taking into account what's happening locally. And
So maybe some macroeconomic sort of influences
yeah, just a recommendation
as well.
that there'd be some way to score that to other metrics.
Sure. It's hard to take that into account too when you're looking at that. The one thing we aren't talking about is that wages have increased too. So I mean, we all look at that shocking number of the expense, but we don't look at the income on it, which we need to kind of look at both. So.
Sure. We can include some overview of our median incomes throughout the city, throughout the county, and nationally, maybe statewide.
Thank you again for that introduction. Do you have something?
I want to make a comment. I was at a poverty conference last week, Tuesday and Wednesday. And one of the best things I heard, and it kind of links some of our goals here together, and that's, one of the big answers to housing insecurity is economic stability. So anything that we talk about, obviously, as we talk about moving levers, we push one lever and another lever moves. So so any of these proposals that do bring in the idea of economic development stability to our citizens and neighbors, I think is very important. It's a big part of short-term and long-term answers. That's what I think we're trying to accomplish.
All right. Our meeting next month, then, we'll be meeting likely the last Wednesday of November, because the fourth Wednesday is right before Thanksgiving. So November 30th would be our next meeting. Thank you all for your time today and contributions. And with that, we will be adjourned at 4:36.
Thank you.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.